So we continue now on the theme of tensions between the coalition partners, particularly as they affect the non-Labor vote. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Zareh Ghazarian to talk about that topic. Zareh is a senior lecturer in politics in the School of Social Sciences at Monash University and a contributor to earlier Howard retrospectives. His research interests include political parties, public policy, politics in the media, and political leadership. He's widely published in Australian politics, and his most recent book is focused on minor parties in the Australian Senate. Zareh, thanks for being with us to talk about the fracturing of the Conservative vote. The screen is now yours.
Well, thank you so very much, and it's an absolute pleasure and privilege to be with you all for this workshop, online workshop. I'd like to start off by talking about the history of very quickly, the coalition and how it evolved in terms of its relationship with other political parties from the right, before moving on to focusing very specifically on what that means for the coalition in contemporary Australian politics. And of course, we need to start off with the victory of the John Howard-led coalition in 1996, which was of course so significant for Australian politics. And not only did it get the Liberal and National parties back onto the government benches for the first time in 13 years, but it also signalled the start of a new era for right-of-centre minor parties in Australia. So in this talk, I will explore the new electoral challenges the Howard-led coalition faced and focus on the emergence of new political parties from the right during this time. The rise of new minor parties was not new. After all, a range of fresh minor parties were mobilising and winning parliamentary representation during the Hawke and Keating years. But what was occurring during the period of the Howard government was the start of a contemporary fragmentation in the right of Australian politics that continues to pose challenges to the coalition to this very day. Despite the period in opposition between 1983 and 1996 being one of turmoil and electoral disappointment, the coalition continued to remain the dominant right-of-centre force in Australian politics. In fact, it was the left of centre that appeared to be fragmenting during the Hawke and Keating governments. For example, in 1984, the Nuclear Disarmament Party emerged in opposition to the Hawke government's policies on uranium. The NDP won Senate representation in 1984 and again in 1987. In 1990, the Western Australian Greens, which combined people from the NDP and others from the conservation and environmental social movements, won its first seat in the Senate and consolidated its place in the chamber in 1993. When the Keating government lost the election in 1996, the Australian Greens, led by Bob Brown, claimed their first seat in the Senate. So despite the right of centre in Australian politics resisting this type of fragmentation, the party system would soon change fairly soon after the 1996 election. A few weeks after the 1996 poll, of course, 35 people died in a mass shooting in Port Arthur, Tasmania. The Howard government's response was to implement a new and comprehensive national firearms policy in a very short amount of time. This reflected the significant public support for reforms to gun laws across many parts of the country, as well as the bipartisanship offered by the opposition and minor parties at the time. However, as Professor Tom Frame explained in his paper earlier, the new gun laws were becoming problematic for the Nationals as many of their supporters expressed significant opposition. When my colleague Philip Alpers from the University of Sydney and I interviewed the late Tim Fisher for a book chapter on Australia's gun laws, he told us about how difficult this period was for his party. He recalled how he and his colleagues had to advance the government's agenda in the public sphere in the face of strong anger being directed to the coalition. At this point, the Nationals were under significant political and electoral pressure as it appeared to be yielding to a city-focused Liberal Party. It is useful to reflect on this moment in Australian politics. In an article written over 2 decades after the Port Arthur tragedy, journalist Michael Gordon recalled how, at the time, Mr Howard believed that the issue of new gun laws would not have a significant impact on the Australian party system. As Mr Howard said, quote, I think anyone made nervous by the suggestion of a new political party is very gullible. I regard it as a big joke." End quote. The new firearms laws seemed to galvanise some coalition voters who were frustrated about policies that were supported by the Hawke, Keating and Howard governments. For example, the previous Labor government's moves to float the dollar, reduce tariffs and start the privatisation of state enterprises such as Qantas was contributing to a sense of greater economic insecurity, especially for those in outer metropolitan electorates. Rather than quell this sense of concern, the Howard coalition showed it was enthusiastic about embracing further economic reforms. As Mr. Howard reflected in his Dean Jench lecture in 2013, the need for economic reform was, quote, "the never-ending foot race," end quote, and that governments could never rest on their laurels. The prospect of further changes to economic policy, the initial moves to start privatising Telstra, and the re-emergence of debates about a proposed GST coincided with the mobilisation of new political forces that would seek to attract coalition voters who were looking for alternatives. Pauline Hanson, who already had a foothold in the national debate thanks to her election to the House of Representatives as an independent in 1996, created her One Nation Party in 1997. The party's platform was highly sceptical of, amongst other things, free trade and advanced economic policies that could serve the interests of rural and regional communities. The party was soon causing electoral problems for the coalition. In the Queensland state election of 1998, for example, One Nation won almost 23% of the primary vote and 11 seats. At the federal level, this led to the coalition's strategy of depriving One Nation of preferences at the national election that was to be held later in the same year. This tactic proved successful. It contained One Nation to just one Senate seat following the 98 poll. Despite the limited electoral impact of One Nation in 98, its emergence was significant because it showed that new right-of-centre parties could win representation in state and federal parliaments. One Nation, therefore, served as the precursor to a new range of right-of-centre forces that would start to challenge the coalition. In 2001, the high-profile Nationals MP for Kennedy, Bob Katter, decided to resign from the party and serve as an independent. Katter had been sceptical of the Howard government's gun laws and had also reportedly been frustrated by the sense that the Nationals had become dominated by the Liberal partners. This led Bob Katter to argue that his party had, quote, "lost its way." Katter was able to retain his seat and arguably has built a higher public profile in subsequent elections. But other minor parties started to emerge as the coalition government's term in office continued throughout the 2000s. In 2004, the Family First Party emerged with its socially conservative agenda, and in 2007, the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party registered with the Australian Electoral Commission with the goal of advancing the interests of rural and regional communities. These parties positioned themselves at the national level as options for right-of-centre voters who felt the coalition was not adequately representing their policy interests. By the time the coalition was defeated in 2007, the right-of-centre minor party genie was well and truly out of the bottle. Newer minor parties continued to emerge and win seats in the federal parliament. In 2010, the Democratic Labor Party was revived and elected to the Senate on a platform that focused on socially conservative values. And in 2011, Bob Katter created a new Queensland-oriented party, Katter's Australia Party. This party went on to win representation in the Queensland State Parliament, where it currently holds 3 seats. In 2013, the Liberal Democrats, a party oriented towards libertarian goals, won Senate representation. Of course, Clive Palmer also made a significant impact on national politics in 2013 when he established the new Palmer United Party. Demonstrating the extent to which there was fragmentation in the major parties, especially in the right, the Palmer United Party contested and won seats in Western Australia, Queensland and Tasmania in the national upper house. This pattern of fragmentation from the right has continued in more recent elections. Following the 2016 poll, South Australian Liberal Senator Corey Bernardi decided that he would start a new Australian Conservatives Party. The party then amalgamated with Family First, and while short-lived, the creation of this party demonstrated the extent to which parts of the political right in Australian national politics had become brittle and would not automatically and consistently vote for the coalition. The impact of new minor parties from the right can also be seen in state parliaments. For example, the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers have now become a significant party in New South Wales, and they currently hold 2 seats in the upper house. In Victoria, the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party holds 1 seat in the Legislative Council. So what does this mean? Well, we can see, if we think back to Australian politics and political history, the fragile governments of Alfred Deakin in the decade after Federation, the short-lived Fusion Liberal Party in the 1910s, and the delicate nature of the Nationalists in the 1920s reminds us that the right of centre of politics in Australia has traditionally been brittle throughout political history in this country. Even the United Australia Party, the predecessor of the Liberal Party, proved to be shaky during the 1930s and 1940s. While the Liberal and National parties have remained relatively stable in the modern era, they've been targeted by a range of new minor parties. The aim of these new parties has been to advance policy goals that they feel have not been adequately addressed by the coalition. For example, part of One Nation's emergence and sustenance has been the sense that governments have become too focused on issues affecting metropolitan electorates. Similar concerns are shared by parties such as the Katter and Shooter, Fishers and Farmers parties. On the other hand, Family First and the revived Democratic Labor Party represent parties that felt the coalition was not effectively representing socially conservative values. The breadth of issues that these parties are interested in also shows that the right of centre in Australian politics remains disjointed. This differs markedly from the left. For instance, the Australian Greens have been able to consolidate and become the second most significant left-of-centre party in Australia. This fragmentation in the right also means that there are new minor party challenges emerging and chipping support off the coalition. In a 2017 interview with Paul Kelly, Mr. Howard reflected on the challenges the coalition faced. As Mr. Howard said, quote, "There is a danger for the coalition in losing people who are instinctively conservatives to parties like One Nation. The Liberal Party must be alive to that. People who vote for One Nation would be, in the main, cultural traditionalists, and these people should find their natural home in the Liberal Party or the National Party. We've got to hold onto those people," end quote. So, to conclude, what are the implications for the coalition, especially the National Party, which has come under significant electoral pressure from parties like One Nation and the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers moving forward? Indeed, the coalition is facing electoral challenges, and it will need to demonstrate its traditional pragmatism on policy in trying to keep its core constituents, as well as trying to attract those undecided voters. Despite the continuous forecasts of doom, the National Party continues to be resilient. Helped by the single-member electoral system used in the House of Representatives, the party continues to win significant representation in the lower house. The Nationals also remain unique in that they are the only, if we call them a minor party in Australia, that continues to regularly enjoy periods in government. Its capacity to have its hands directly on the levers of power should not be underestimated. How the party uses this position will be critical in determining whether the Nationals continue to hold its place in Australian politics in the future. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions, comments from the audience.
Zareh, thank you so much for that, clear and precise as always. Zareh, our first question really goes to the issue of the source of voter support for the non-Labor minor parties, which you've described. We know that, and we've known for some decades, I think, that there's been a decline in party identification in Australia for both the major parties. But I would like you perhaps to speculate about which of the two major conservative parties, Liberal or National, suffers most from this fracturing of the vote. Where are these voters being drawn away from, chiefly, in your view?
I think thank you for the question, and I think that's the really important and really interesting point that we've seen. If we think back to the 1990s and the rise of One Nation, certainly Pauline Hanson was seen to be the biggest threat, especially to the National Party. And I suspect the Nationals have always been the target of doom and gloom predictions. Numerically, they are not as strong, obviously, as the Liberal Party. Their primary vote, in terms of national primary vote, looks very small compared to the major parties and even the Greens. And there is this continual expectation that at the next election, the Nationals are going to be in a lot of trouble. So I suspect part of that early story of the last 25 years has been that the Nationals have been losing ground to these new minor parties, as well as independents that we've seen emerge, such as Bob Katter. But I suspect over more recent elections, and really after that midpoint of the Howard government and moving into the post-Howard period, we've started to see such a diverse range of parties from the right that it really is now a problem for both Liberal and National parties. I was just looking at the New South Wales election result, the Senate election result in 2019, and from my rough maths, there's some 12 to 13% of the primary vote has gone to parties such as the Shooters Party, the Shooters Fishers Party, the Fraser Anning's Conservative Party, the Liberal Democrats, the UAP, the DLP, One Nation. All of these have just chipped away votes, and that makes it very, very hard for the coalition to continue to perform as best it can.
Zareh, sorry to interrupt. I was simply going to ask whether the major parties recapture those discontented votes through the flows of preferences. Does that make them perhaps a bit complacent about the threat?
I think that's a really good point. And certainly I think in post-2016, they may be more complacent. The significance, of course, of 2016 was that up until then, there was the electoral system in the Senate could allow minor parties to wheel and deal preferences and essentially cobble together enough of the vote to win a seat, even though their primary vote was really, really low. The reforms brought in 2016 have worked against that to some extent. And so I do agree, I think, that certainly at the moment, there is this sense that if the primary vote goes away from the party, they will still catch it through the redistribution, through the distribution of preferences. But even that, it's a bit of a risky strategy for any political party to then be thinking, well, we'll just leak votes and they'll come back to us. There's something going on in that voters are looking at the major parties, and in this case, if we think about the Nationals and the Liberal Party, and thinking, well, they're not adequately representing our interests, and so we're going to try someone else and see what happens.
Do you think that would help to explain, leadership speculation within the National Party, the rise of what would you call them? People who can sell themselves pretty well. You know to whom I refer, but
I think so.
Okay.
I think the retail politician comes to mind.
That's the term.
It's the idea that the Nationals need a retail politician to lead them to electoral success. It's interesting if we think to the sorts of successes that the Nationals have had. It's been based on that idea of serving the interests of the local community, to galvanise, to ensure that they've got that support, and then to ensure that those people continually support the party during elections. I think in terms of if we were to name names, and if we were to say people such as Barnaby Joyce, certainly they are attracting the gaze of the media regularly, but will that necessarily turn the election and turn what's going on in Australian politics? Probably not. I think there's something a bit more underlying that's going on, and it reflects perhaps the positioning of the Liberal Party as much as it does the National Party, because there have been concerns that over recent years the Liberal Party hasn't been perhaps as much of a broad church as it could be. And these debates are not only, of course, had at the national level, but also in state divisions of the party as well. I'm in Victoria, and we can observe those sorts of battles going on a fairly day-to-day basis in the state parliament within the Liberal Party and, of course, the coalition partner, the Nationals.
Zareh, Mr. Howard is well known for that expression of the Liberal Party being a broad church, and in some ways it's been useful in order to help keep together a grand coalition of lots of different sorts of views within the Liberal Party. Is there anybody within the Nationals that you can see who could articulate a similar sort of broad, welcoming view, and in other words, managing the sorts of disputes that you now see play out at the electoral level, managing those sorts of disputes within the party itself, keeping it within the House?
That's a good point to think about, because if we think about the Nationals, generally they seem to be, as a whole, as a collective, fairly united on the matters that are important, the policy matters that are important. It's often the case where, when we look at the Liberal Party, that's where the challenges, the tensions are. And because the Liberal Party, of course, is so dependent on the directive and the leadership of the party leader, that the capacity for coalition leadership really does rest on that capacity of the Liberal leader to navigate those troubles. The Nationals, while they do have divisions, they're not as deep. For example, we remember the disputes between the wets and the dryers during the 80s and early 90s in the Liberal Party.
Yes.
We think about now the emerging divisions that we can see between socially conservative versus more socially smaller liberals. So it's more of the Liberal Party that is, what's going on there is impacting, I would think, the perceptions and voting performance of the Nationals as well.
In the old days, and I forbear from calling them the good old days, there was a sense in which Liberals and Conservatives, in the small c sense of those terms, held together because there was an obvious sort of threat in communism, internally and externally. What would the threat be that one would have to unite the conservative forces within Australia and to stop this leakage from the National Party, speculatively?
Sure, and in terms of speculating, I think there are those challenges that we're seeing at the moment, and we saw elements of that play out at the state level in Victoria in 2018, where the party decided that it was going to make the issue of crime, law and order, traditional sort of state government issues at the forefront of its agenda. And it appeared to be reducing the significance of debates about the economy, jobs, enterprise and so on. The Victorian voters responded to that by giving Labor a very comfortable majority in the state parliament. I think that's a bit of a cautionary tale for the coalition and in particular the Liberal Party, that there is this sense that the Liberal Party should be broad enough and thinking about economic policy, the issues of small government rather than seek to impose something that people might perceive as an ideological agenda. As we can see, there are minor parties that are pushing these very specific issues, whether it is about libertarian or other sorts of social policy. But it's that area of pragmatic, big picture politics that the Liberal and National parties have traditionally done well in and have been well rewarded by the electorate, that perhaps that's where their natural happy hunting ground would be.
Zareh, that takes us quite nicely into the next sort of questions, or the next area of questions, which are about what the drivers are of this fracturing of the vote. What you seem to be suggesting there is that the issues are largely cultural. They're not necessarily urban versus rural, for example, but they're really about immigration issues, about environmentalism, lifestyle sorts of issues, perhaps. Is that the way you see the primary drivers of this fragmentation?
I think so. It seems to be that economic matters of the economy seem to be, on the whole, being reduced in terms of their prominence in the political debate, both by the Labor and coalition parties. There seems to be almost a general consensus amongst the major parties about economic policy. But where those tensions lay, and both in terms of between the parties and within the parties themselves, is that tension between progressive issues, conservative issues, but they revolve around those social issues, often more times than not. What that suggests again is that when these new parties are emerging and are attracting support, no matter how small they might be in terms of percentages, they are tapping into that disaffection that people are saying, well, I'm not going to be supporting the major parties on this. I'm not going to be supporting that natural right of centre party that I may have voted for in the past. I'm concerned about something else that they are not talking about. Here's a very specific party that does what I want it to do. I'm going to support them.
Zareh, lastly, can I ask you where all this is leading? Is there a sense that this is the new normal, that this is the type of churn of political ideas and fragmentation in voting intentions on the non-Labor side? Is that where it's going? Or is there a sense that the National Party vote, for example, will diminish to unseeable low levels?
No matter what, the Nationals are well served by the voting system in the lower house. So I'd expect them to continue to win significant numbers in that chamber and continue to be a major feature of government and deciding who governs. I think, however, the potential challenges are about how to try and attract voters on the right who have determined that the major parties from the right are no longer representing their interests. And it is about this sense of pragmatism. It is about that flexibility that the Liberal Party and the National parties have demonstrated in the past to be able to accommodate those differences, to be able to absorb all those policy demands, and in a way present those voters who have been disillusioned, disenchanted, a way back into supporting the main parties from the right. Certainly doable, but at this stage there's a trend that appears to be favouring those minor parties in terms of gaining prominence and gaining and chipping away those votes from the main parties.
Zareh, well, we've run out of time, and I really want to thank you so much for presenting to us today. That was splendid.
My pleasure.
Thank you again, and can I tell all our delegates that we are moving to a 5-minute break, so please go back to the main timeline and then join us again in a few moments' time, 5 minutes' time, for Professor Linda Bottrell. Thanks very much, Zareh. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Cheers.